Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And since unfortunately there's been the recent passing of Donald Sutherland, I've decided to do a few movies in memoriam of him. So I've chosen three Donald Sutherland films to do during this week. One of which would be one I've never seen before, the second would be one that's considered a classic, and the third would be one that's just one of my personal favorites. So I've already done the one that I haven't seen before, so now we move on to the classic, which also happens to be a viewer request, and it's the 1978 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Here is your trivia question for today. What well known actor makes a very small cameo near the beginning of this film? The answer will be at the end of this episode. This film starts somewhere distant off in the outer rims of space, where we actually see some space spores that are leaving their location and traveling on the solar winds until they get to Earth. Once they land on our planet, they begin to evolve and change and become something new, resembling a flower pod. Now, one of our main characters, Elizabeth, discovers this flower and, thinking that she's found a new species, brings it back home with her. Although by the next morning, the flower is no longer anywhere to be found, and her husband, Jeffrey, seems very different. In fact, not even himself anymore. So when Elizabeth goes to work that morning at the health department, she discusses with her coworker Matthew about how she doesn't believe her husband is who he is. Matthew then suggests that Elizabeth talk to one of his best friends, David, who also happens to be a psychiatrist, to see if he can help her narrow down what the issue really is. Now, what she finds out when talking to David is that apparently there's been a rash of hysteria in the city, as so many people are talking about living with or running into people that they know that aren't themselves anymore. Then we head over to the Belichick Spa, which is run by Jack and Nancy, who also happen to be friends of Matthew. Nancy stumbles onto something shocking, some weird creature or thing that actually is starting to look more and more like her husband Jack. So now it seems that it's up to Matthew, Elizabeth, Jack, Nancy, and David to figure out what's going on, but they do soon realize that there's no one left they can trust. Not the police, not their loved ones, and maybe not even each other. So without any ability of truly knowing who's friend and who's foe, will our heroes be able to save the day? This movie was directed by Philip Kaufman, and he even managed to sneak in a quick cameo as the gentleman who's knocking on the phone booth trying to get Matthew's attention. Rose Kaufman, Philip's wife, even has a brief cameo as the woman arguing with Jack at the bookstore. This movie is based off of the 1955 novel The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. Now, this is one of four films that were actually created based off of this book. You have the original film from 1956, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, this film from 1978, The Body Snatchers from 1993, and The Invasion from 2007. Other properties that were also inspired by this book were The Faculty from 1998, Assimilate from 2019, and the 2018 musical stage production, The Guy Who Didn't Like Musicals. Donald Sutherland was a great choice for the character of Matthew. Sutherland also insisted on doing his own stunts, so the scenes at the pod factory were actually done by him with harnesses and nets. Brooke Adams plays the character of Elizabeth, and you might think that sequence where she does that weird thing with her eyes would be something that would come up later to prove that she is who she is. But in actuality, Kaufman just wanted his actors to make weird and odd faces throughout the production. And when he found out that Adams could do that, he just thought it was so cool that he wanted to put it into the film. Leonard Nimoy was brought in to play the character of David, mainly due to the fact that Kaufman wanted everyone to be able to see him be creepy and be able to emote, so that he wouldn't get typecast due to his very emotionless and stoic character of Spock from Star Trek. Now, if you were curious as to why Nimoy is wearing that leather half glove, the reason he does so is by choice. He thought it would be more distinctive and recognizable. Also, he got the idea from a friend who had a burn on his hand and used that to cover it up. Jeff Goldblum plays the character of Jack, and this would not be his only time appearing in a sci-fi horror remake. He also was in The Fly from 1986. Veronica Cartwright, who plays the character of Nancy, is the only main actor from this film to go on and appear in another one of the other films based off of the book, as she was in The Invasion. There were actually a few familiar faces from the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 that appeared in this film. The original director from the first film, Don Siegel, plays the taxi driver. Now, what's funny is, during that sequence, you can actually see genuine fear on the faces of Sutherland and Adams. The reason for this is that Siegel had actually lost much of his vision by this point and was driving at night without his glasses. Kevin McCarthy, who also appeared in the first film, makes a brief cameo in a very similar role this time around. Now, what's funny is there was a naked homeless man lying on the curb nearby where they were filming that recognized McCarthy and actually said to him, the first one was better. Apparently referencing to the fact that even though this film had not actually come out yet, that the first one would be better. Here's something interesting you might not be aware of, but Harry the homeless man that's playing a banjo was not singing and was not playing the banjo. In fact, it was actually Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead doing both. Here's something I can't believe I didn't notice my first time watching the movie. The pod people garbage men are crushing up dusty gray matter. That's actually what's left of humans after they've been changed. There's a book that a strange man at the mud baths recommends to Nancy called Worlds in Collision. This was a book published in 1950 and was a New York Times bestseller, but it was met with overwhelming rejection due to its thesis. The idea or theory in this book was that in the 15th century BC, Venus was ejected from Jupiter as a comet and passed by Earth, changing Earth's orbit and axis, causing innumerable catastrophes that are mentioned in both early mythologies and religions from around the world. The night after the movie released, someone actually went around putting pods out on the streets of Los Angeles and apparently really freaked people out as the police received so many phone calls. So, in the basic script that pretty much everyone had, including Veronica Cartwright, in the ending scene, it said that both Nancy and Matthew see each other and share a knowing glance. But only the director, Philip Kaufman, the writer, W.D. Richter, and Donald Sutherland knew what the actual ending was going to be. So, when Veronica Cartwright all of a sudden is faced with Donald Sutherland pointing his arm out and making the screech of the aliens, her reaction was real. So the sound effects used for the pods were actually a heartbeat that was Kaufman's wife's ultrasound. And the sound effects used for the screeching of the aliens was just pig squeals. Something that the original film and this film have made famous is calling certain people pod people. However, they don't actually call them that in the films. Something else this film is probably also always going to be famous for is the dog with a human face. This movie was entirely filmed in California, and it also completely takes place there in San Francisco. So when it comes to the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I absolutely love this movie. In my opinion, it's one of the best, if not the best, sci-fi horror remake that exists. I also especially love the special effects, like the practical effects used throughout this film for something that was made in the late 70s, and the sound effects that were used, and the acting. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 5. And if you enjoyed this movie, other films I recommend checking out are They Live, Invaders from Mars, Slither, and The Faculty. And now for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode. What well-known actor makes a very small cameo near the beginning of this film? You may have never noticed this before, but well-known actor Robert Duvall has a brief cameo as the priest near the beginning of this film. The reason for this is he was in San Francisco at the time and had previously worked with Philip Kaufman on the film The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid from 1972. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.